After an accident, Emily Hayes found strength where others saw limits. Now, an untamed horse and an ancient symbol guide her journey to revive lost traditions and transform lives. At Ashwood, the impossible is about to unfold. The morning mist rolled over the bluegrass hills of Kentucky like a gentle tide, wrapping the world in a silvery embrace. Emily Hayes watched from her wheelchair as the sun's first rays pierced through the fog, casting long shadows across the prestigious grounds of Ashwood Stables. The anticipation in the air was palpable. Today marked the beginning of the Lexington Equestrian Festival, an event that had defined her family's legacy for generations. Emily adjusted her position, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair with practiced ease. The accident 2 years ago might have changed her circumstances, but it hadn't diminished her spirit or her connection to this world of grace and power. If anything, it had strengthened her resolve. She watched as grooms and handlers bustled about, preparing for the day's events, their movements a choreographed dance she knew by heart. Miss Hayes. A young stable hand approached, his expression a mixture of respect and uncertainty. Mr. Thornton asked if you'd like to be escorted to the VIP viewing area. Emily smiled, shaking her head. Thank you, but I prefer to stay closer to the action. There's something about being at ground level that lets you feel the thunder of hooves in your bones. The boy nodded and retreated, leaving Emily to observe the warm-up ring where riders were putting their mounts through their paces. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats against packed earth filled the air, a heartbeat she'd known since childhood. Her grandfather, Henry Hayes, had always said that horses could sense the truth in a person's soul. It's not about what your body can or cannot do, he told her. It's about the spirit within. The memory brought both warmth and a hint of sadness. Her grandfather had left this world with so many stories untold, so many mysteries unexplained. The latest advertisement for the festival had featured an old photograph of him standing proudly beside a magnificent stallion, wearing a peculiar pendant that Emily had never seen in person. A commotion near the main arena drew her attention. A crowd was gathering, their excited murmurs carrying across the morning air. Emily maneuvered her chair along the packed gravel path, curiosity pulling her forward. As she approached, the crowd parted respectfully, allowing her a clear view of what had captured everyone's attention. In the arena stood the most magnificent horse Emily had ever seen. A stallion of impossible black, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning light. But it wasn't his beauty that held everyone spellbound, it was his defiance. The horse reared and spun, refusing to submit to his handler's commands. His movements weren't those of a frightened animal, but rather of one who chose rebellion. That's Orion, a voice said beside her. Emily turned to find Rachel Foster, the festival's historian, watching the display with keen interest. He arrived last week from a private breeder. No one's been able to work with him successfully. Emily couldn't take her eyes off the stallion. There was something about him that called to her, something in the way he held himself against the world's expectations. As he turned, the sun caught a marking on his neck, an intricate pattern that sent a jolt of recognition through her. She'd seen that symbol before, in dreams that had haunted her since childhood. He's extraordinary, Emily breathed, leaning forward in her chair. He's dangerous, came a sharp voice from behind them. Jack Thornton, owner of Ashwood Stables, approached with his characteristic purposeful stride. His face was lined with concern as he watched the ongoing struggle in the arena. We may have to withdraw him from the festival. We can't risk. But Emily was no longer listening. Her attention was fixed on Orion, who had suddenly gone still. The great horse turned his head, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, his eyes met hers. In that gaze, Emily saw something that stole her breath: recognition, challenge, and possibility. If this story has captured your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Let us know which city you're watching from, and now, let's continue. The following days at Ashwood Stables brought a flurry of activity as the Lexington Equestrian Festival gained momentum. Emily found herself drawn back to the training arena each morning, watching as trainer after trainer attempted to work with Orion. The proud stallion's reputation grew with each failed session, but Emily saw beyond his defiance to something deeper, a yearning for understanding that matched her own. One particularly warm afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the arena, Emily made her decision. She approached Jack Thornton, who was deep in conversation with Derek Blake, the festival's most celebrated trainer. Derek's family had dominated the equestrian world for decades, their methods traditional and uncompromising. "Mr. Thornton," Emily called out, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I'd like to work with Orion." The conversation stopped abruptly. Derek turned, his expression a mixture of disbelief and poorly concealed amusement. "Miss Hayes," he said, his tone carefully measured, "while your family's history with Ashwood is respected, surely you can't be serious." Emily met his gaze squarely. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." Jack Thornton studied her with careful consideration. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, the respect he'd had for her grandfather warring with his concern for both her safety and the stability of his prestigious event. "Emily," he began gently, "Orion has resisted our most experienced trainers, even if you weren't." He gestured vaguely at her wheelchair, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Because of this," Emily said, touching her wheelchair, "I understand him better than anyone else here. Sometimes the strongest spirits are born from learning to move through the world differently than others expect." A figure at the edge of the arena caught her attention, a man she didn't recognize, dressed in elegant but understated clothes. Around his neck hung a pendant that made her breath catch. Even at this distance, she could see it matched the marking on Orion's neck perfectly. But before she could call out to him, he melted away into the crowd. "Give me a chance," Emily pressed, turning back to Thornton. "Just 1 week. If I can't make progress with him, I'll step aside." Jack Thornton ran a hand through his silver hair, a habit Emily had noticed emerged when he was wrestling with a difficult decision. Finally, he nodded. 1 week, Miss Hayes. But at the first sign of trouble. "There won't be," Emily assured him, even as Derek Blake scoffed and strode away, his disapproval evident in every step. That evening, Emily lingered at the stables after most others had left. She wheeled herself to Orion's stall, where the great horse stood watching her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. The stable was quiet except for the soft sounds of horses settling in for the night and the distant call of whippoorwills. "Hello, beautiful boy," she said softly, stopping at a respectful distance. "I think you and I have a lot to learn from each other." Orion's ears flicked forward, and he moved closer to the stall door, stretching his neck toward her. In the fading light, the marking on his neck seemed to shimmer with an inner luminescence. Emily reached into her pocket and withdrew an old photograph she'd found while going through her grandfather's things. One that showed him standing beside a horse with an identical marking, wearing that same mysterious pendant she'd seen on the stranger today. "What secrets are you hiding?" she whispered, more to herself than the horse. As if in answer, a warm breeze rustled through the stable, carrying with it the scent of sage and ancient mysteries. Orion nickered softly, and in that moment, Emily felt the first threads of a connection that would change everything she thought she knew about her family's legacy. The early morning light filtered through the dusty windows of Ashwood's old tack room as Emily sorted through decades of accumulated equipment. Her first session with Orion was scheduled for later that morning, and she wanted to find the perfect tools to begin their work together. But something else drove her search, an inexplicable feeling that this room held answers to questions she hadn't even formed yet. Her grandfather had spent countless hours here, she remembered, organizing and maintaining the equipment with meticulous care. As she reached for a worn leather bridle hanging on a hook, her hand brushed against something tucked behind it. A weathered envelope fluttered to the ground, landing just within her reach. The paper was yellowed with age, her grandfather's distinctive handwriting still clear across the front, for when the marked one returns. Emily's hands trembled as she opened it, careful not to tear the fragile paper. Inside, she found a letter written in the same careful script. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, then you've found your way to where the truth begins. I've watched you grow, seen the dreams that haunted your sleep, the same dreams that once haunted mine. The symbols you drew as a child weren't imagination, they were memory, passed down through generations of our family. We are more than just trainers, Emily. We are guardians, chosen to protect and preserve an ancient bond between humans and horses. The marking you've seen, the one that appears in your dreams, is the symbol of unity, a sacred sign that appears only on horses destined to bridge the gap between past and present. There is so much more I should have told you, but some truths can only be discovered, not taught. Trust your instincts. They will guide you to what was hidden. Look for the pendant. It will lead you to others who share our calling. With endless faith in you, Grandpa Henry." Emily pressed the letter to her chest, her mind racing. The symbol on Orion's neck, the mysterious man with the pendant. Suddenly, pieces began falling into place. But before she could process this revelation, voices outside the tack room drew her attention. "This is unacceptable," Derek Blake's sharp tone carried through the partially open door. That horse is too valuable to be handed over to someone who can't even stand on their own 2 feet. The Hayes family may have history here, but times have changed. Mind your tone, Blake. The response came from a voice Emily didn't recognize, smooth and authoritative. You don't understand what's at stake here. I understand plenty, Reed. Your precious traditions have no place in modern equestrian sports. It's time to let the old ways fade. Emily carefully moved closer to the door, straining to hear more, but the voices were already moving away. Reed, was that the name of the man with the pendant? She looked down at her grandfather's letter again, understanding blooming. The pendant would lead her to others who shared their calling. Later that morning, as Emily wheeled herself toward the training arena, she felt different. The letter's weight in her pocket grounded her, gave purpose to the connection she'd felt with Orion from the start. She dressed practically in well-worn riding clothes, adapted to her needs, with her grandfather's old training halter across her lap. A small crowd had gathered to watch, including Derek Blake, whose presence at the rail carried an air of eager anticipation for failure. But Emily barely noticed them. Her focus was entirely on Orion, who stood in the center of the arena, his black coat gleaming in the morning sun. As she entered the arena, Emily felt a shift in the air, something electric and ancient. Orion's head lifted, his nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. The symbol on his neck seemed to pulse with an inner light, or perhaps it was just her imagination, charged by the morning's discoveries. "Hello, old soul," she said softly, wheeling closer. The great horse watched her approach, but made no move to flee. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, his ears focused forward with intense interest. Emily reached into her pocket, touching her grandfather's letter for courage, and began to hum a melody she hadn't realized she remembered, an old song her grandfather used to sing in the stables late at night. The melody that Emily hummed seemed to float on the morning air, carrying with it memories of countless nights spent in the stables with her grandfather. As the familiar tune filled the space between her and Orion, something extraordinary happened. The great stallion's eyes softened, and his breathing fell into rhythm with the song. "That's an ancient guardian's song," a quiet voice said behind her. Emily turned to find the mysterious man from before, Reed, standing at the arena's edge. In the clear morning light, she could see his pendant clearly, an exact match to the symbol on Orion's neck and the drawings from her childhood dreams. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And how do you know about the Guardians?" Reed smiled, but before he could answer, Derek Blake strode over, his presence shattering the moment's tranquility. "This is hardly the time for old fairy tales," he sneered. "Miss Hayes, if you're quite finished with your musical performance, perhaps we could see some actual horse training?" Emily felt Orion tense behind her, responding to the hostile energy. She reached back without looking, and to everyone's amazement, the stallion stepped forward to nudge her hand gently. The crowd around the arena grew silent, watching the impossible unfold. "The bond is already forming," Reed murmured, so quietly that only Emily could hear. "Just like Henry said it would." Emily's hand found the letter in her pocket. "You knew my grandfather?" "We all did," Reed replied cryptically, his eyes scanning the growing crowd. "But this isn't the place for that conversation. Come to the old stone barn at sunset. Bring what you found in the tack room." He turned to leave, but Emily called after him, "Why didn't you approach me sooner?" "Some truths can only be discovered when the time is right," he answered, echoing her grandfather's words from the letter. "Continue your session. Show them what a true guardian can do." Emily turned back to Orion, who had remained unusually calm throughout the exchange. In his deep brown eyes, she saw something that transcended normal horse-human relationships, an ancient wisdom waiting to be understood. Moving with deliberate grace, she began to work with him, using techniques that seemed to flow from some deep ancestral memory. Her wheelchair became an extension of her body as she guided Orion through basic exercises, her movements fluid and assured. The great horse responded with increasing trust, matching her energy and focus. From the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Derek Blake's scowl deepening. He stood with a small group of trainers, gesturing animatedly as he spoke in hushed tones. But Emily remained focused on Orion, letting the rest of the world fade away. As the session progressed, Emily discovered that her chair offered unique advantages in working with the horse. At his eye level, she could communicate with subtle gestures and energy shifts that might have been missed from a standing position. Orion seemed to understand her instinctively, as if they shared a language beyond words. Near the end of their time together, Emily guided Orion to the center of the arena. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting their shadows in sharp relief against the packed earth. As she raised her hand in a gesture she somehow knew from her dreams, Orion lifted his head proudly. The symbol on his neck caught the light, seeming to shimmer with an inner fire. "Good boy," she whispered, and in response, Orion lowered his magnificent head to her level, his breath warm against her cheek. In that moment, Emily felt the weight of generations of guardians watching through time, witnessing the renewal of an ancient bond. As the crowd began to disperse, Jack Thornton approached, his expression a mixture of amazement and curiosity. "I've never seen anything like it," he admitted. "Perhaps there's more to your grandfather's methods than I realized." Emily smiled, but her mind was already racing ahead to sunset and the mysteries waiting to be revealed at the old stone barn. She had so many questions, about the Guardians, about her family's legacy, and about the deeper purpose behind Orion's appearance at Ashwood. As she prepared to leave the arena, she noticed something hadn't been there before, a small marking in the dirt near where Orion had stood, similar to the symbol on his neck but more elaborate. By the time she looked up to point it out to someone, the marking had vanished, as if it had never existed. But Emily knew what she had seen, and she understood that her journey into the world of the Guardians was only beginning. The old stone barn stood silhouetted against the setting sun, its weathered walls glowing amber in the fading light. Emily approached slowly, her wheelchair crunching over gravel as she made her way down the seldom-used path. The letter from her grandfather felt heavy in her pocket, like it carried the weight of generations. The barn's massive wooden doors were already slightly ajar, a warm light spilling out from within. As Emily drew closer, she could hear the soft murmur of voices and the familiar scent of hay and leather mixed with something else, sage and an unfamiliar incense that seemed to tug at ancient memories. "Welcome, Emily Hayes," Reed's voice carried from inside as she reached the entrance. "We've been waiting for you." The interior of the barn took her breath away. What had always appeared abandoned from the outside was transformed. Lanterns hung from the ancient beams, casting a golden glow over a space filled with artifacts and symbols she recognized from her dreams. Around a large circular table stood a group of people, each wearing pendants identical to Reed's. "The Circle of Guardians," Reed explained, gesturing to the group. "We've gathered here since your grandfather's time, keeping the old ways alive." An elderly woman stepped forward, her silver hair gleaming in the lantern light. "I'm Sarah Blackwood," she said warmly. "I trained alongside your grandfather when we were young. Henry always said you would find your way to us." Emily moved closer to the table, noticing it was carved with intricate patterns that matched the symbol on Orion's neck. "My grandfather's letter mentioned guardians, but I don't understand. What exactly are we guarding?" "Balance," Sarah replied, running her hand over the table's surface. "Harmony between humans and horses, between past and present. There have always been special horses, marked ones like Orion, who carry ancient wisdom. And there have always been those chosen to work with them, to ensure their gifts aren't lost or misused." Reed placed a leather-bound book on the table. "This is the Chronicle of the Guardians. It contains the history of our order, and records of every marked horse that has appeared through the generations." He opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with detailed drawings and text in various hands. "Your grandfather was its keeper." Emily's eyes widened as she recognized her grandfather's handwriting on some of the newer pages. But why keep all this secret? Why not share this knowledge? "Not everyone believes in preserving the old ways," another guard. Ian spoke up. "Some, like Derek Blake's family, see horses only as tools for profit and prestige. They've worked for generations to discredit and discourage our practices." Sarah nodded gravely. "The Blakes once were guardians themselves, until they turned away from our traditions. They've spent years trying to erase all traces of the old knowledge." "That's why your grandfather protected you," Reed added. "He knew the time wasn't right yet. But now, with Orion's appearance and your natural connection to him, things are changing." Emily pulled out her grandfather's letter. "He mentioned the symbol of unity. What exactly does it mean?" Sarah gestured to a large tapestry hanging on the wall, its elaborate embroidery depicting horses and riders moving in perfect synchronization. "The symbol of unity represents the sacred bond between human and horse spirits. When it appears on a horse like Orion, it signals a time of renewal, a chance to restore balance that's been lost." As Emily studied the tapestry, she noticed something that made her gasp. Woven into the ancient scene was a figure in what appeared to be a wheelchair, working with a magnificent black horse. The design was subtle, almost hidden within the larger pattern, but unmistakable. "Yes," Sarah said softly, noting Emily's discovery. "The Guardians have taken many forms throughout history. What others see as limitations, we recognize as unique perspectives, different ways of connecting with these extraordinary creatures." A warm breeze swept through the barn, making the lanterns flicker. In the dancing shadows, the symbols on the walls seemed to move, telling stories Emily somehow knew she would soon understand. But before she could ask more questions, there was a commotion outside. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the sacred atmosphere. The approaching headlights cast long shadows through the barn's windows, breaking the mystical atmosphere. Reed quickly gathered the chronicle, while Sarah extinguished several lanterns. The other Guardians moved with practiced efficiency, concealing the more obvious sacred artifacts. "Your grandfather prepared for this," Sarah whispered, pressing a small wooden box into Emily's hands. "Keep it safe. Inside is something you'll need when the time comes." Before Emily could examine the box, the barn doors swung wide open. Jack Thornton stood there, his imposing figure backlit by the vehicle lights. Behind him, Derek Blake emerged from an expensive SUV, followed by several members of the festival's board of directors. "I thought I might find you all here," Derek said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Mr. Thornton, as I mentioned, these gatherings have been occurring more frequently. It's a liability issue." Jack Thornton surveyed the scene, his expression troubled. "Emily, what exactly is going on here? Derek has raised some serious concerns about unauthorized use of festival property." Emily met his gaze steadily, the wooden box secure in her lap. "Mr. Thornton, we're simply preserving traditional horsemanship techniques. Techniques that built Ashwood's reputation." "Traditional superstition, you mean?" Derek interjected, moving into the barn. His eyes locked onto Reed's pendant before scanning the partially hidden symbols on the walls. "The festival board has worked hard to establish Ashwood as a modern equestrian center. We can't have people thinking we operate based on mystical nonsense." One of the board members, a woman in an expensive suit, stepped forward. "Mr. Thornton, given recent developments, perhaps we should review Miss Hayes's arrangement with Orion. The liability concerns alone." "Liability?" Emily's voice cut through the tension. "Orion has shown more progress in 2 days with me than in weeks with conventional trainers. Or are you more concerned about what happens when people see that success doesn't fit your narrow vision?" A heavy silence fell over the barn. Jack Thornton looked between Emily and Derek, decades of tradition warring with modern pressures in his expression. Finally, he spoke, "The festival begins in earnest tomorrow. Emily has my permission to continue working with Orion. Her results speak for themselves." Derek's face darkened. "You can't be serious. She's filling people's heads with fairy tales about magical horses and ancient guardians. It's embarrassing to the entire equestrian community." "The only thing embarrassing," Reed stepped forward, his voice calm but powerful, "is the length some will go to suppress what they don't understand. Your own family once knew the value of these traditions, Derek." Blake's face flushed with anger. "Don't you dare speak about my family. Those days are long past, and good riddance to them." Emily wheeled herself between them, her presence somehow commanding despite her seated position. "The past isn't as far behind us as you think, Mr. Blake. Tomorrow, Orion and I will prove that there's room for both tradition and progress at Ashwood." "We'll see about that," Derek replied coldly. He turned to the board members. "I trust you'll all be present for tomorrow's demonstration? I think it will be most enlightening." As the group filed out of the barn, Emily caught sight of Jack Thornton lingering behind. His eyes moved thoughtfully over the partially visible symbols on the walls. "Your grandfather," he said quietly, "once told me there was magic in these old stones. I never quite believed him until now." After they had all gone, and the Guardians emerged from the shadows, Emily finally opened the wooden box. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a braided cord of horsehair, woven with threads of silver and gold. Intricate knots along its length formed familiar patterns, the same symbols she'd been seeing in her dreams. "The Unity Rain," Sarah explained softly. "Used by Guardians for generations to demonstrate the sacred bond. Your grandfather kept it safe, knowing you would need it." Emily ran her fingers over the ancient braiding, feeling energy pulse through the cord like a living heartbeat. Tomorrow, she said with quiet determination, we show them all that some traditions are worth preserving. Reed placed a hand on her shoulder. But be careful, Emily. Derek Blake's hatred of the old ways runs deeper than you know. He'll do anything to discredit what we stand for. As the group dispersed into the night, Emily remained in the barn for a moment longer, holding the Unity Rain and feeling its power resonate with something deep within her soul. Tomorrow would change everything. She could feel it in her bones. The question was, would it be a change for better or worse? Dawn broke over Ashwood Stables with an ethereal quality, golden light filtering through a light morning mist. Emily arrived early, the Unity Rain carefully stored in her saddlebag, its presence a constant reminder of the weight of tradition she now carried. The festival grounds were already buzzing with activity, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air that hadn't been there before. As she approached Orion's stall, she immediately sensed something was wrong. The great stallion was agitated, pacing in his stall, his usual calm demeanor replaced by nervous energy. When he saw Emily, he pressed against the stall door, nostrils flaring. "What happened, boy?" she whispered, reaching up to touch his neck. The symbol there seemed duller somehow, less distinct. Emily glanced around the stall and noticed subtle signs of disturbance. Hay scattered unusually, water buckets slightly askew. Sarah appeared beside her, her face grave. "Someone was here last night," she said quietly. "They used lavender oil. It's known to make horses anxious during performances. An old trick, but effective." Emily's hands tightened on her wheelchair's arms. Derek Blake. No proof, of course. But this isn't the first time such tactics have been used against the Guardians. Sarah pulled a small pouch from her pocket. "Fortunately, we have our own traditional remedies. Your grandfather taught me this blend." As Sarah worked to calm Orion with her herbs, Emily noticed activity increasing around the main arena. The demonstration was scheduled for mid-morning, and already spectators were claiming the best viewing spots. Among them, she spotted several board members in their formal attire, and Jack Thornton deep in conversation with a group of influential trainers. Reed appeared, looking troubled. "Emily, there's something else you should know. Blake has requested to demonstrate immediately after you, with his prize stallion, Thunder's Pride. He's planning to show proper training techniques." Emily nodded slowly, understanding the challenge. "He wants to discredit everything we stand for by comparison. Make us look foolish." "The board members will be scoring both demonstrations," Reed confirmed. "Their evaluation could influence the future of traditional training at Ashwood." As the morning progressed, Emily prepared Orion with meticulous care, working to counter the effects of the lavender oil. The Unity Rain seemed to pulse with energy as she carefully unpacked it, its intricate patterns catching the light. When she finally held it up to Orion, the great horse grew still, as if recognizing something ancient and familiar. Just before the demonstration was to begin, Emily found a moment of quiet with Orion in the warm-up area. She drew out her grandfather's letter, reading it one more time for courage. As she did, a small note fell from within its folds, one she hadn't noticed before. In her grandfather's handwriting were the words, "The true bond needs no proof. Trust in what you feel, not what others expect to see." The announcement system crackled to life, calling Emily and Orion to the arena. As she wheeled toward the entrance, Derek Blake stepped into her path. "Last chance to withdraw gracefully," he said softly, so only she could hear. "Save yourself the embarrassment." Emily met his gaze steadily. "You know, Mr. Blake, I've been wondering, what made your family turn away from the Guardians? Was it fear of what you didn't understand, or fear of what you did?" Something flickered in Derek's eyes, pain perhaps, or a memory he'd rather forget. But before he could respond, the announcer called Emily's name, and the crowd's applause filled the air. As she entered the arena, Emily felt a shift in the atmosphere. The morning sun had broken through completely now, bathing the space in clear light. Orion moved beside her with fluid grace, the Unity Rain hanging loose between them. In that moment, Emily remembered something else her grandfather used to say, "The greatest magic isn't in making others believe, it's in daring to believe yourself." She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of generations of Guardians watching through time. The demonstration was about to begin, and with it, a chance to bridge the gap between past and present, between tradition and progress. The future of Ashwood's soul hung in the balance. The arena fell silent as Emily and Orion took their position at the center. The morning sun cast their shadows in sharp relief against the pristine sand, and in that moment of stillness, Emily felt every eye upon them. The Unity Rain sparkled with an inner light, its golden and silver threads catching the sunlight. She closed her eyes briefly, remembering her grandfather's words from the hidden note, "Trust in what you feel, not what others expect to see." When she opened them again, the world seemed to shift slightly, as if adjusting to reveal a deeper reality beneath the surface. Emily began to hum the ancient melody she'd learned in her dreams, the one that had first connected her with Orion. The great stallion's ears pricked forward, and the symbol on his neck began to shimmer with renewed clarity. Without any visible signal from Emily, Orion started to move. What happened next left the audience breathless. Emily guided her wheelchair in perfect harmony with Orion's movements, the two of them weaving patterns across the arena that seemed to echo the ancient symbols hidden in the old stone barn. The Unity Rain floated between them like a strand of starlight, barely needed but completing the circuit of their connection. From the corner of her eye, Emily caught sight of the board members leaning forward in their seats, their expressions transformed from skepticism to wonder. Even Derek Blake, standing at the rail, appeared transfixed by the display. As they moved, Emily began to understand something profound about the Guardian's legacy. It wasn't about controlling these magnificent creatures. It was about creating a space where both human and horse could express their truest nature. Her wheelchair, which some had seen as a limitation, allowed her to dance with Orion in ways no standing rider could have managed. The patterns they traced in the sand began to glow subtly, visible only to those who knew what to look for. Sarah and Reed, watching from different points around the arena, exchanged knowing glances. The old magic was awakening, responding to the authentic connection before them. In the midst of their dance, Orion suddenly raised his head high, letting out a sound that was neither a whinny nor a neigh, but something more ancient, a call that seemed to echo through time itself. To everyone's amazement, horses in the distant stables answered, their voices joining in a chorus that raised goosebumps on every arm. Emily felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't try to hide them. This was what her grandfather had prepared her for, not just a demonstration of horsemanship, but a reawakening of the sacred bond between humans and horses that had shaped civilizations. The Unity Rain began to pulse with visible energy, its woven patterns matching the symbol on Orion's neck. As they moved into the final sequence of their dance, Emily noticed something extraordinary. The wheelchair no longer felt like a separate entity. It had become part of the dance itself, its wheels tracing patterns that complemented Orion's hoofprints perfectly. Jack Thornton stood at the rail, his hands gripping it tightly as he watched. The expression on his face was one of recognition, as if he was finally seeing something he had known about all along but had forgotten until this moment. As their performance reached its crescendo, Emily and Orion moved as one being, their shadows merging in the morning light. The final pattern they traced in the sand was the symbol of unity, but larger and more complex than anyone had seen before. It seemed to ripple outward from them in waves of invisible energy that touched every person present. When they finally came to a stop, the silence was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have paused their morning songs. Emily reached out to touch Orion's neck, feeling the powerful connection between them thrumming like a plucked string. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone began to applaud. The sound spread like wildfire until the entire arena thundered with it. Emily saw Sarah wiping tears from her eyes, while Reed stood tall and proud, his pendant gleaming in the sunlight. But their triumph was not yet complete. As the applause began to die down, Derek Blake stepped forward for his demonstration, his face set in grim determination. Yet something had changed. In his eyes, Emily caught a glimpse of recognition, of remembered truths long buried. Whatever happened next would determine not just the future of Ashwood Stables, but the preservation of an ancient legacy that the world needed now more than ever. As the applause faded and Emily moved to the side of the arena, Derek Blake stepped forward with his prized stallion, Thunder's Pride. The horse was a magnificent specimen of modern breeding, muscled, gleaming, and perfectly groomed. Yet something in his eyes seemed distant, disconnected. Derek's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the lead rope, a detail so subtle that only those closest to the rail noticed it. The morning's demonstration had shaken something loose in him, awakened memories he'd spent decades trying to suppress. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried across the arena, practiced and professional, "I'm about to demonstrate proper modern training techniques that have brought success to champions across the world. No mysticism, no fairy tales, just proven methods." But as he began his demonstration, something unexpected happened. Thunder's Pride became increasingly agitated, resisting commands he'd performed flawlessly hundreds of times before. The horse's eyes kept drifting to where Orion stood with Emily, the symbol of unity still gleaming on his neck. Sarah leaned close to Emily, whispering, "Watch carefully. The old blood remembers, even when minds try to forget." Thunder's pride suddenly reared, pulling away from Derek's control. In that moment of chaos, a pendant slipped from beneath Derek's collar, an old, worn piece identical to those worn by the Guardians, though its surface was tarnished with age and neglect. The sight of the pendant caused a ripple of murmurs through the knowing observers. Emily wheeled forward slightly, understanding blooming in her mind. "It wasn't that your family abandoned the old ways," she called out to Derek. "You tried to hide from them." Derek's facade cracked, his professional demeanor crumbling as he struggled to regain control of both his horse and his emotions. "You don't understand," he said, his voice raw. "My grandfather. He was like yours, Emily. He believed in all of this. The symbols, the sacred bonds. But the modern world was changing, and we were losing everything trying to hold on to the past." Thunder's pride calmed slightly, but continued to gaze at Orion with an intensity that spoke of recognition beyond ordinary horse behavior. The symbol of unity on Orion's neck pulsed gently, casting a subtle glow that reached across the arena. "Show them, Derek," Reed stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Show them what you've kept hidden all these years." With trembling fingers, Derek pulled a worn leather pouch from his pocket. Inside was a length of braided horsehair, much like Emily's unity rein but darker with age. "My grandfather's last gift," he admitted. "I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it, even after we turned to modern methods." Emily moved closer, the modern arena seeming to fade around them as ancient energies stirred. "The old ways don't reject progress, Mr. Blake. They adapt, evolve. That's why the Guardians have survived through every age. What if the real progress isn't in denying the past, but in finding ways to bring its wisdom forward?" Thunder's pride stepped toward Emily and Orion of his own accord, drawing Derek with him. The horse's movement was purposeful, almost reverent. When he came within a few feet of Orion, both horses raised their heads in perfect synchronization, and a soft light began to emanate from beneath Thunder's pride's coat, revealing a long-dormant symbol of unity, faint but unmistakable. Sarah gasped softly. "Two marked ones. It hasn't happened in generations." The board members and spectators watched in stunned silence as Derek Blake, the great modernizer, fell to his knees in the sand. His shoulders shook with suppressed emotion as decades of denial crumbled away. "I tried so hard to forget," he whispered. "To convince myself it was all superstition. But every time I work with horses, I feel it, the echo of something deeper, something real." Jack Thornton stepped into the arena, his presence commanding attention. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, "Ashwood's future lies not in choosing between tradition and progress, but in finding ways to honor both." The unity rein in Emily's hands began to pulse with renewed energy, responding to the awakening of ancient bonds. As she watched Derek slowly stand, clutching his grandfather's braided rein, he understood that this moment was about more than just proving the validity of the Guardian's ways. It was about healing a breach that had wounded both past and present, about finding a path forward that embraced both the wisdom of ages and the possibilities of the future. The days following the demonstration brought unprecedented changes to Ashwood Stables. The morning sun rose over a transformed landscape, where modern equipment sat comfortably alongside ancient symbols now proudly displayed. The old stone barn, once hidden and neglected, had become a center of renewed activity. Emily sat in her wheelchair at the entrance of the training arena, watching as Derek Blake worked with Thunder's pride using his grandfather's braided rein. The change in both horse and trainer was remarkable. Gone was the rigid insistence on control. In its place, a growing understanding of partnership and mutual respect. "It's like watching someone wake up from a long sleep," Sarah observed, standing beside Emily. The old knowledge was never truly lost, just waiting to be remembered. Inside the main stable, Jack Thornton had authorized the creation of a new training program that combined traditional Guardian wisdom with modern techniques. The board members, still amazed by what they'd witnessed, had unanimously approved the initiative. "Your grandfather would be proud," Reed said, approaching with the Chronicle of the Guardians in his hands. "Not just of you, but of what you've helped set in motion." He opened the book to a fresh page, where new entries had been made documenting the unprecedented appearance of two marked horses at once. Emily smiled, touching the unity rein that now stayed with her always. "I think he knew this would happen. All those years of keeping the traditions alive, waiting for the right moment. He was preparing for a time when the world would be ready to remember. Across the arena, Derek was demonstrating to a group of young trainers how to incorporate Guardian techniques into their work. His voice carried clearly through the morning air. The symbols aren't just marks, they're a language. A way of understanding the deep connection between humans and horses that has always existed. The symbol of unity on Orion's neck seemed to glow more brightly these days, and the matching mark on Thunder's pride grew stronger with each passing day. The two horses often work together now, their synchronized movements drawing visitors from across the country. "We've had inquiries from other stables," Jack Thornton said, joining them at the rail. "People are interested in learning about the Guardian traditions. It seems you've started something bigger than Ashwood." Emily watched as a young girl in a wheelchair, visiting with her parents, reached out to touch Orion's nose. The great horse lowered his head gently, and for a moment, the symbol of unity pulsed with a warm light. The girl's face lit up with wonder. "The world needs this now more than ever," Emily said softly. "Not just the connection with horses, but the reminder that wisdom comes in many forms. That what some see as limitations can actually open doors to new ways of understanding." Sarah nodded, pulling out a stack of letters. "We've received messages from people all over, sharing stories of unusual markings they've noticed on their horses. The awakening is spreading." Derek approached, his grandfather's rein glinting in the sunlight. The tarnished pendant he wore had been cleaned and restored, now hanging proudly alongside his modern training credentials. "Emily," he called out, "there's something I want to show you." He led them to the old stone barn, where workers were carefully restoring the ancient symbols while preserving their authenticity. But it was what lay beneath the barn that took Emily's breath away. The hidden chamber she had discovered had been respectfully expanded, transformed into a space where the history of the Guardians could be properly preserved and studied. "We found more artifacts," Derek explained, his voice filled with the enthusiasm of rediscovery. "Letters, journals, training tools. Generations of knowledge, just waiting to be understood. My grandfather's records were here too, alongside your grandfather's. They worked together, all those years ago." Emily wheeled through the space, taking in the carefully arranged displays. Modern lighting highlighted the ancient symbols, while climate-controlled cases protected fragile documents. It was a perfect blend of past and present, just as the new Ashwood had become. "The festival board wants to make this an official part of next year's event," Jack Thornton announced. "A celebration of both traditional and modern horsemanship. They're calling it the Legacy Summit." As if in response to these words, both Orion and Thunder's pride let out deep resonant calls that echoed through the stable yard. The sound rippled across Ashwood's rolling hills, carrying with it the promise of a future where ancient wisdom and modern progress could walk side by side. The autumn air carried the scent of possibility as preparations for the Legacy Summit transformed Ashwood stables. What had begun as a local revelation had grown into something far more significant. Visitors from across the globe had begun arriving early, drawn by the stories of two marked horses and a young woman who had helped bridge the gap between past and present. Emily sat in the restored chamber beneath the stone barn, surrounded by carefully preserved artifacts and modern digital displays. She was reviewing submissions from other stables and trainers who claimed to have discovered similar symbols on their horses. The Chronicle of the Guardians lay open beside her, its pages now supplemented with detailed photographs and documentation. "We've confirmed 3 more marked ones," Reed said, entering with a tablet displaying images from stables in Ireland, Argentina, and Japan. Each one appeared after the news of Orion and Thunder's pride spread. It's as if they were waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Sarah approached with a stack of letters in her hands. The responses to the summit invitations are overwhelming. Traditional horsemen from Mongolia, Native American horse trainers, classical dressage masters from Europe, they're all coming. Many of them have been keeping their own versions of Guardian traditions alive without knowing others existed. Emily wheeled herself to a new installation where digital screens showed live feeds from participating stables around the world. "My grandfather always said the old ways never truly vanish. They just wait for the world to remember why they mattered." Derek Blake entered the chamber, looking energized despite the long hours he'd been putting into the summit preparations. The tarnished pendant he'd hidden for so long now gleamed proudly against his modern riding attire. "The first group of scholarship students arrives tomorrow," he announced. "Young riders from all backgrounds, including 3 who use wheelchairs. They're here to learn both traditional and modern techniques." "Just like your grandfather would have wanted," Jack Thornton added, descending the stairs with careful steps. "Speaking of which, we've made an incredible discovery in the old archives. Emily, there's something you need to see." He handed her a weathered journal, its pages filled with her grandfather's handwriting. But unlike his other records, this one contained detailed prophecies about the return of the Marked Ones. On one page, a sketch showed a gathering of horses bearing the symbol of unity, arranged in a pattern around a central figure in a wheelchair. "He knew," Emily whispered, touching the drawing gently. "He saw all of this coming." Outside, the sound of arriving horses drew their attention. Through the chamber's newly installed windows, they could see a group of Mongolian horsemen riding up the main drive, their horses adorned with traditional decorations that echoed the Guardian symbols. Behind them, horse trailers bearing the logos of prestigious European stables pulled in. "They're early," Sarah noted, checking her tablet. "The summit doesn't officially begin for another week." "They're not here for the summit yet," Reed explained. "They're here for the gathering." Emily looked up with interest. The gathering was a new tradition they'd created, where all identified marked horses would be brought together for the first time in recorded history. Orion and Thunder's Pride had been practicing their roles as the first to be revealed, their movements in the training arena drawing gasps of wonder from even the most experienced trainers. The chamber's lights flickered briefly, and the symbol of unity on the wall began to pulse with a soft light. Above, they could hear the horses responding to some unheard call. Emily felt the unity rain in her lap begin to warm, its woven patterns glowing gently. "It's starting," she said softly. "The awakening we've all been preparing for." Jack Thornton placed a hand on her shoulder. "When you first arrived at Ashwood with your dreams of working with Orion, I thought we were simply dealing with a young woman's ambition. Now I understand we were witnessing the beginning of a renaissance." Through the window, they watched as more vehicles arrived, horse trailers, cars, and buses carrying people from every corner of the equestrian world. Each brought their own stories, their own pieces of the ancient knowledge that was gradually being remembered and restored. "Tomorrow," Emily announced, "we'll begin documenting everything. Every tradition, every technique, every scrap of wisdom that's been preserved. Not just in books and videos, but in a living library of knowledge that will continue to grow and evolve." As if in response to her words, a chorus of whinnies rose from the stables, Orion and Thunder's Pride leading dozens of horses in a sound that seemed to echo across time itself. The symbol of unity on the chamber walls pulsed in harmony with their calls, a reminder that some connections transcend all boundaries. The day of the gathering dawned with an almost ethereal quality, the Kentucky hills shrouded in a mystical morning mist. Ashwood stables had been transformed, ancient symbols now proudly displayed alongside modern amenities. The great arena, specially prepared for this historic event, was surrounded by thousands of spectators from across the globe. Emily sat in her wheelchair at the center of it all, the unity rain glowing softly in her hands. Around her, in a perfect circle, stood all 7 of the marked horses that had been discovered since Orion's revelation. Each bore the symbol of unity, their marks pulsing in synchronization like a heartbeat shared among them. "It's exactly as your grandfather drew it," Sarah whispered, standing beside Emily with the old journal open to the prophetic sketch. Every detail, even the way the horses would arrange themselves. In the stands, traditional horsemen from Mongolia sat beside European dressage masters. Native American horse trainers shared stories with Australian stockmen. The boundaries between old and new, between different cultures and traditions, seemed to fade in the presence of something far more ancient and universal. Derek Blake approached, leading Thunder's Pride. The formerly skeptical trainer now moved with the dignity of someone who had found his way home after a long journey. "Everything's ready," he said softly. "All the marked ones are in position." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of generations of guardians watching through time. Orion stepped forward without being led, taking his place beside her. The great stallion's presence felt like an anchor in a moment that seemed to hover between past and present. Throughout history, Emily's voice carried across the hushed arena, amplified by modern technology but carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. Horses have been our partners in building civilizations, in crossing boundaries, in understanding ourselves. The Guardians didn't create this connection. They recognized it, honored it, and preserved it for future generations. As she spoke, the symbol of unity on each horse began to glow more intensely. The unity rain in her hands pulsed with light that spiraled up through the air, connecting with each mark in turn. The effect was breathtaking, lines of light weaving between the horses in patterns that echoed the sacred geometry hidden beneath the old stone barn. "Today," Emily continued, "we don't just celebrate the return of the marked ones. We celebrate the bridging of worlds, between past and present, between different traditions, between all the ways humans and horses have learned to understand each other. On cue, each horse moved in perfect synchronization, guided by their riders who represented different equestrian traditions from around the world. The patterns they traced in the arena sand began to glow, forming larger versions of the ancient symbols that had once been hidden away. Jack Thornton stepped forward, his voice strong with emotion. From this day forward, Ashwood Stables will serve as the first Guardian Academy, a place where old wisdom and new knowledge come together, where limitations become possibilities, and where the bond between humans and horses continues to evolve. The unity rein in Emily's hand suddenly flared with brilliant light, and each marked horse raised its head in perfect unison. The sound that emerged was unlike anything anyone had ever heard, a harmony of horse voices that seemed to carry echoes of every era they had shared with humanity. In that moment, Emily felt her grandfather's presence strongly, as if he stood beside her watching his vision unfold. The prophecy in his journal hadn't just been about the return of the marked ones. It had been about this moment of connection, of remembering, of moving forward while honoring what came before. The ceremony concluded with each horse and rider demonstrating their own tradition's way of celebrating the bond between human and horse. The arena lights dimmed, leaving only the natural glow of the symbols of unity and the patterns of light they had created. As Emily looked around at the faces of those gathered, the proud guardians, the converted skeptics, the eager young riders ready to learn, she understood that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The legacy wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about creating a future where wisdom could flow freely between generations, traditions, and cultures. The final light of day caught the unity rein, sending sparkles of gold and silver across the arena. Above, the first stars began to appear, the eternal circle of day moving into night, reflecting the endless cycle of knowledge being lost and found again. In the end, it was about more than horses and humans, more than symbols and traditions. It was about the eternal dance between past and present, the courage to bridge worlds, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most powerful magic lies in simply believing in possibilities. Dear listeners, we hope Emily's journey of discovery and renewal has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about connection, tradition, and the power of believing. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity and beauty of life. Don't miss our upcoming content. We look forward to reading your comments below. Together, let's keep the magic of storytelling alive.